Hello, my name is Bebar Starkus, and I was an intern for Arts for Refugees. And for part of my project, I decided to write about the post-war situation in Srebrenica. Srebrenica is a town in East Bosnia, in what is the Republic of Srpska, which is one of the two entities that govern Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was the site of a horrendous massacre in the year 1995, so exactly 30 years ago. On July the 11th, Serb forces engulfed the town. They laid siege to it. They drove out the women. They gathered the boys and the men, and they shot them, and they threw their bodies into a ditch. And this became known as the Srebrenica massacre. Srebrenica still exists. It's a town, people live there, but it's a town that's incredibly marked by the death and destruction that occurred there. And the process of mourning was half complete. And I wanted to look at that process of mourning. I wanted to look at the town as it stands. And I describe a lot of the physical infrastructure, but also the mental infrastructure of the people that live there. It's a town that's divided between ethnic Serbs, Orthodox Serbs, and Bosnians, Muslim Bosnians. And how they get along, well, in many ways they don't really get along. They get along superficially, but the echoes of the past are still resonant, and sometimes they're deafening, especially around the time when the massacres are being commemorated. So one of the most enjoyable things about this project was, I think, reading the testimony. And I say enjoyable, what I really should say is one of the most chastening parts of it, but it was enjoyable in the sense that I got to learn a lot about this part of the world that I didn't really know that much about, quite frankly, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. I'm a Russian and East European studies major at Oxford, so this area is supposed to be my bread and butter, but I primarily focus on Russia itself and its relations with the Middle East. So I don't really get to see that much of Yugoslavia, of the former Yugoslav Republic, and of the Balkans. And the Balkans are an incredibly rich area. I mean, they've been controlled by a whole freight of foreign powers. You could think of the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, lots of Russian influence, obviously. And it's an area that's really brimming with diversity. And in many ways, that diversity was its strength, but it's also a source of conflict. And we're trying to look at how that conflict manifests. In looking at the massacres of Srebrenica, I had to apply some of the rules that I learned from the journalism course that I took, one of the Thomson Reuters journalism courses, which covered war reporting and how we're meant to cover war crimes and atrocities. And although my piece is a bit more narrative, more retrospective, it looks at things in the past rather than reporting on war crimes as they're occurring, as a war reporter might do. I still had to apply many of the lessons that I learned in that journalism course, which you would be taking if you decide to do this internship. One of the lessons was being careful about the use of language. So for instance, I don't describe at any point in my story, I don't describe the events in Srebrenica as genocide. Obviously, I talk about the genocide memorial, but I don't use that word. I use a word like massacre or slaughter, which is an objective description, although an emotionally freighted one. It's an objective description of what happened on those days between July the 11th and July the 14th, 15th. And the reason I do that is not because I don't think it's a genocide. I do, but the reason I do that is so that the story, if you will, the story doesn't have to revolve around the semantics of what is a genocide, because the label genocide is strongly contested by the Serbian government, by Republika Srpska, which is a Serbian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina that was created in the Dayton Accords in the aftermath of this war. And my goal wasn't really to enter into a semantic debate about what constitutes war crimes, what constitutes genocide. Obviously, a lot of the leaders of the Serbian forces, like Ratko Mladic, were convicted of genocide. So I think that the use of the word genocide is defensible from a journalistic standpoint, because that's how it's been deemed by courts. And in international law, the courts have the ultimate authority in determining what constitutes genocide, crimes of humanity, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, that was a huge part of my reasoning, and another part of my reasoning was another big piece of advice, and that it was to just tell what happened. So in beginning my story, I decided instead of beginning with the ethnic tensions or whatnot, I would begin by just describing the area and describing Srebrenica, because it's quite a nice area. I mean, you have this little town that's cradled in a valley, and if I didn't know what was going on there, I would say, oh well, this is just your run of the mill, pristine, scenic European towns. And knowing the history, obviously, you know what lies beneath. But still, I mean, it's a nice place to go, and even the derelict buildings that I described, sort of these bombed out former apartment blocks with basically gaping holes for windows. I would like to see them too. I mean, that's part of a big part of the urban landscape where I grew up in Philly, where we had our fair share of abandoned buildings in the suburbs. Nevertheless, you're describing things like this is very hard, because you have to put weight, you have to weigh things, weigh elements, weigh testimonies. What should you bring up? What's gory? What's insensitive? What's essential? These are all considerations that you have to bear in mind as a writer. And in creating the posters for that accompany this piece, I had to pay mind not to be a bit too showy, not to be a bit too theatrical with it, because ultimately what I'm trying to do is talk about a human tragedy, and a human tragedy that's very important to hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of Bosnian children were born of war rapes committed by Serb soldiers against Bosnian women. So that's not something that you can deal with lightly, and one of the reasons I decided not to create a game for this piece as opposed to the artsy refugee, one, we were told to create it for the artsy refugee, but I think especially for this it wouldn't have worked, because this is such a difficult thing to handle with tact and to gamify, and I felt that it needed to be dealt with a sense of sobriety, because the tensions are still very much alive, and that fire is still burning. Srebrenica is located in Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is a majority Serbian political entity within Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the local Serbian government has a lot of power. It's pretty close to Belgrade, the Serbian central government in Serbia. So the Bosnian Muslims who live in this island, engulfed by a Serbian nation, really, they have to be careful about how they commemorate their dead and how they remember things like Srebrenica. And that's very interesting. In Western Europe, we're used to a very open remembrance culture around the Holocaust. In Germany, actually, among the perpetrators of genocide, is quite unique in that it's relatively open about the ways that its ancestors committed these just unspeakable atrocities. Whereas if you think about countries like Serbia, countries like Turkey with its mass killings of Armenians in the fall of the Ottoman Empire, these kinds of things are not talked about, or they're denied, or in many cases they're celebrated, really. And I tried to talk about that, and there was one instance that shocked me where Serbian hackers, presumably Serbian hackers, we don't know who, renamed the Bosnian genocide memorial at Srebrenica to Ratko Mladic Park. And of course Ratko Mladic is the Serbian general who organized the mass killings at Srebrenica. So that's incredibly, incredibly chastening when you read something like that. And it reminds you of the toll that genocide remembrance can take, especially for the perpetrators, because you have to fess up to having done these ignominious, almost inhuman things to other people. And oftentimes that's not something that people want to do. It's a question of national pride. I think the fact that the massacres are 30 years on, and we're living in a world where, seemingly at least, the principles of international law are being called into question. We could think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza, what's happening in Sudan. In the 90s, there was this real sense that with the fall of the communist states, there was going to be a rebirth of democracy, or a birth of democracy in many countries that were, if you will, that were under the shackles of communist rule, as some very optimistic liberals might have put it. But that tendency and that belief was overshadowed by a growing cynicism and realism in international politics. You could think about the war in Iraq, or the 9/11 wars generally. That really chipped away a lot of people's confidence in the United States as a global power. And I fear that we're entering into a world where, frankly, events like Srebrenica just become more and more common. And Srebrenica is often compared in Europe to Bucha, which was a massacre perpetrated by Russian forces invading Ukraine. Bucha is a suburb of Kyiv. And the Russian forces there slaughtered some 400, 500 Ukrainian civilians, left their bodies flailing on the ground. And in many respects, the massacres at Srebrenica, although they were at a larger scale, were reprisal. And in fact, Russia is an ally of Serbia, was an ally of Serbia back then. And the West's invasion of Serbia, the bombing of much of Serbia during that war, during the Bosnian War, was a wake-up call to a lot of Russian leaders who felt that their sphere of influence was being challenged by the West, and they didn't like that. And that's one of the reasons that led to Russia taking a more aggressive foreign policy. So all that's to say that Srebrenica is an incredibly important event in European history, and I'm very happy to have been able to chronicle it for Arts for Refugees, because it's an event from which really very few people have healed. And you still hear these testimonies of old women who survived the massacre who wake up screaming in the night. And I think about that, and it stays with me, because I fear for what's to come, really, for future generations. And I don't want them to have to go through Srebrenica, and I hope that this will be a call to action, really, for people to learn more about how crimes of humanity come about, how dehumanization operates in in-group dynamics. And I hope that people learn from that, and that they learn, importantly, not to repeat the mistakes of the past.